Hi, welcome back. I'm Connie Sokol, your host, and I am so thrilled to have today, again, our favorite psychologist in residence almost. It's Debra McClendon. Thanks so much for joining us today, Debra.
Thanks for having me, Connie.
We are so happy to have you talking to us about this really important and prevalent subject. We're talking today about this toxic perfectionism and religious scrupulosity. So if you're not familiar with those terms, we're going to talk about that today. And what does it look like? And then how can we handle that within ourselves or with family members that we're seeing? How can we actually use some coping skills to get through that and move through it? So let's just jump right in. I'm going to share a little bit about Debra, and then we're going to jump right into some of these key questions. As you know, she's a clinical psychologist with training in marriage and family therapy, and also specializes in helping those with religious OCD, which is scrupulosity. On that, she also has online courses on anxiety and also OCD, scrupulosity, and fantastic content. So if you're looking for something to help someone with, that is a great thing to do with getting her online courses. They also have a book her and her husband co-authored on strengthening marriage, and she sees clients, personal clients, and being able to help them move forward in these particular areas, all kinds of mental health spectrum, but particularly these specializations. And I have to say, it seems to me, is it just coming out more that people are talking about this more openly, or are you seeing more religious scrupulosity? What seems to be the feel for you?
I think it's simply that I've been attempting to make this more aware for the public, more into the public's awareness. There we go.
I agree.
And it's just been an underrepresented population. These people have been struggling for a long time. And I think a lot of people, when they find my podcast and they listen to these and the articles and things, they just finally feel validated that somebody knows what they've been going through. I don't believe that there's an increase of problem. I just think we are now learning more about this, becoming aware, and I've kind of taken that upon myself to try to get the word out and educate people about what may be actually happening for them.
I love that. It sounds like opening that dialogue, and instead of it being more of a under the rug, or someone just thinks there's something horribly wrong with them, that they're able to have this dialogue about, oh, this is a thing. Like, I didn't know it wasn't just there's something, I think there's something wrong with me. It's a thing and I can do something about it.
Exactly.
So, in order to make sure we're on the same page, can you just give us kind of the definition that you work from for this toxic perfectionism and then the scrupulosity, just some kind of a basic definition of these?
Okay. If you don't mind, I'd like to compare the toxic perfectionism to regular positive perfectionism first to give people a healthy comparison. Would that be okay?
You bet.
Okay, so as we kind of think about our discussion today, I want you to think about perfectionism in a healthy way. And what we'll do is we'll call that striving for excellence. In the literature, they can talk about it as positive perfectionism, or they call it adaptive perfectionism, perfectionism that's helpful. But basically, this is striving for excellence. I am all about setting high goals and working hard. I think it's wonderful, and that's how we create a life filled with meaning and purpose, which is what you like to focus on. But there's a difference between being anxiously engaged, as Neil A. Maxwell said, and being over anxious. So someone with positive perfectionism, adaptive perfectionism, someone who's striving for excellence, they may be anxiously engaged in trying to live a good life. They may set high standards for themselves, but they're setting those standards not because they have anxiety or fear about failure. They're setting those standards because they want to reap the positive blessings of meeting their goals and having a purpose-filled life. Now, because they're striving for excellence is in a healthy balance in their lives, if they don't meet their goals, they're not particularly disturbed about that. They may relook at their goals, they may problem solve, they'll engage with the problem, but it's not devastation to them emotionally if they don't reach those goals. Also, these people are very careful and devout in their religious worship, but they're careful in all areas, which is a contrast, particularly in scrupulosity, where religious focus tends to get very trivial and narrow. So here's a researcher that I'd like to share his quote. Healthy religious observance is generally typified by moderate and flexible approaches to most areas of religious belief and practice. viewing perfect adherence as more of an ideal than as an imperative that is necessary to avoid subjective guilt or the threat of severe punishment. So somebody with adaptive perfectionism has high goals and they're living life and everything is in great balance. And that's what we want to strive for. Now, the toxic perfectionism are those who are the over-anxious group, right? Neil A. Maxwell, there's a difference between being anxiously engaged and over-anxious. We don't want to be over. The word over is just always a problem, right? We don't want to be over on anything, right?
I love that. I love that you share that perfectionism, that the traits, that the core blocks of seeking for excellence is different than this inordinate pressure we put on ourselves and a lack of give to be able to
Yes.
live our lives. It sounds like it's a very constraining, restricting thing.
When you start moving into the territory of struggling with mental health, you'll find rigidity and lack of flexibility is a core feature in so many issues, not just the ones that we're talking about today. So one of my general therapy goals for people is to create cognitive flexibility, get them opening up their thoughts and their minds and considering different options and different solutions. It's just really important to be able to have that flexibility. So because the over-anxious person has lost some flexibility, they have a frantic effort to live error-free. You can see why all of a sudden you see that that's not going to work very well, right? One researcher says the tendency to believe there is a perfect solution to every problem, that doing something perfectly, such as mistake-free, is not only possible, but also necessary, and that even minor mistakes will have serious consequences. So when someone with this type of perfectionism doesn't reach their goals, it's devastating. It's devastating. They have anxiety, panic, they have obsessive rumination, because they don't have the flexibility to know how to work with that.
Exactly. It sounds like, and working towards a goal, there's going to be, the reality is there's going to be setbacks and obstacles and all those things, because that's the process. That's where the growth happens. So it's a natural part of living. That's what we do. But it sounds like for someone with toxic perfectionism, that their focus is on, don't make a mistake, don't fail. You can't go off the rail. You can't do it wrong. So
Right.
the energy and the focus is not on the growth and who you're becoming. It's on, don't make a mistake. Is that about right?
Exactly. One researcher called it an unrelenting quest for flawlessness.
Ah, and that pressure. I mean, that's not even once you've attained the goal, that's to get to the goal. And how many actually do that? I mean, you think of all the high success, high achieving people, inventors, and people who have done business and all kinds of things that we celebrate. How many failures, quote unquote, they've had to go through to learn the process. So, wow, this is really
Exactly.
keeping someone from living and becoming then.
Exactly. One researcher said the perfectionist paradigm typically combines unrealistic expectations. Okay, there's a piece. Unrealistic expectations with an unhealthy preoccupation with faults, weaknesses, mistakes, and sins. Fear of failure is a constant concern. Just a horrible way to live, and people get stuck in this. And yet one researcher says, thus the problem with, excuse me, the problem with perfectionism is not high expectations. So again, we love to strive for excellence. It is neurotic expectations that are unrealistic and oppressive.
I love that. And I think that is such an important distinction. And it sounds to me, to be able to understand that distinction, which one is it for me, is how it's making you feel. Are you feeling energized to accomplish that goal? Are you feeling motivated to try to accomplish that? Or are you feeling oppressed by it? It sounds like that's maybe a defining.
If you're feeling anxious, if you're feeling afraid, and that's your motivation, it's probably not adaptive perfectionism. It's probably toxic on some level.
On some level. And it sounds too, when you were saying that another indicator might be as you go along and you experience those very normal everyday setbacks and things that will happen when you're achieving a goal or working on a project, that if those setbacks paralyze you and they shut you down or they're devastating, instead of, okay, how can I solve this? How can I work around it? That might be another indicator. Would that be right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. And one of the reasons toxic perfectionism also becomes a problem is because someone who's struggling with this, there is no win solution for them. It's a lose-lose. So if they don't meet their ridiculously unrealistic high standard, then the message to them that they tell themselves is, I'm not good enough. So they end up in a cycle of counterproductive behavior and self-criticism. They just rip themselves down, right? And that is never going to motivate you to do better. It's just going to discourage you. Now, if they do meet their standard temporarily, they also don't win then, because the criticism is, well, my goals must not have been high enough. They reappraise their goals and they set it higher, so they actually can never reach their goals in a way that feels meaningful and satisfying to them. And so you can see the distortion in that process there.
Yes, and that lack of life contentment, that lack of fulfillment, that feeling of I'm never enough, I'm never going to make it, I'm never going to get there, which anyone would feel in that situation,
Yes.
because it's the setup. We're set up not to win. So talk to us about, it seems like this perfectionism and scrupulosity kind of feed each other. So talk to us about what drives this perfectionist thing. Then it seems leads into the scrupulosity. If I do everything just right, if I check all the boxes and do all that, then I should be, on paper, I should be okay. So how does this sort of feed into the scrupulosity, to the behaviors?
Yeah, so I have something from a researcher that I think is perfect to answer that question. They say OCD sufferers may initially be seeking to be scrupulous in a non-pathological sense. They have good intentions for trying to be conscientious in their religious observance. But the problem grows until functioning is severely affected. The initial concern was appropriate, the eventual consequences destructive. Now, with scrupulosity, there are 6 regularly highlighted cognitive domains in OCD. Perfectionism is just one of them. So perfectionism can lead into scrupulosity, as we just read, but it's not only perfectionism. So I thought I'd just mention those for your listeners so that they can be aware.
Absolutely. That would be great.
If I can find my paper here. So some cognitive domains that are very specific to obsessive compulsive disorder is the overimportance of thoughts. So most of us recognize that brains generate thoughts. That's just what they do. And we have completely random, bizarre, sometimes disturbing or morbid thoughts or blasphemous thoughts all the time. But our brains are generating thoughts so quickly that halfway into the thought, we're already letting it go and we're moving on to the next thought. So we recognize that thoughts are just thoughts and we don't have to get too wrapped up in a thought. But someone with OCD, if they have a thought that perhaps is blasphemous or perverted in some way or disturbing in any kind of fashion, then it becomes very threatening to their sense of self, and they wonder if they really wanted to have those thoughts, and then they build all this energy and this desire to control. And so the overimportance of thoughts just is a real problem. Then it leads to the importance of controlling their thoughts. And then there's also the domain of perfectionism, which we've been talking about. And then inflated sense of responsibility. They usually feel like it's their fault, always. An overestimation of threat, something that maybe someone without OCD or anxiety might say is a minor threat, someone may think is a very urgent, catastrophic threat. And so they become very impulsive and compulsive with their behavior because the anxiety makes them feel like everything is urgent. And then the last one, which is a huge feature in scrupulosity and OCD in general, is the intolerance of uncertainty. Did I sin? Didn't I sin? Do I need to talk to the bishop? Don't I need to talk to the bishop? Did I hurt their feelings, or is it okay? What were my intentions pure? Did I have doubt? Was I being blasphemous? And that's just heart-wrenching, tormenting stuff with people with scrupulosity. So yes, the perfectionism is a huge part of of this, but it's only one piece of the huge piece, if that
That
makes sense.
makes total sense. And you can see how one sort of webs to another, because one sort of begets another behavior. Because if you're not being super perfect, then you're feeling super guilty. And then you're really magnifying, what did I do? What did I not do? And then you're putting punishments on yourself. And this cycle, it's almost like a rabbit hole, this vortex that we could send ourselves down.
Right, that overinflated sense of responsibility then,
Yes.
right? Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly.
women do this all the time. I know I have in the past. I know women talk to me about it, where you're apologizing all the time and you're taking on something that is totally someone else's, but you're taking it on and feeling badly for, or apologizing for. What have you seen experiences in people that you've seen or worked with, or that you've seen in case studies and things like that, of what this could look like in daily life? So for example, if a woman's going about and she's doing, she's doing her religious calling, or she's serving the community, or she's helping her children, she's being a faithful, dutiful mother, are you seeing some examples of this is something that started out good that's magnified and gone wrong? This is what it kind of looks like in daily life.
Um, it just is different for every person. The general fear is the same, but it
Mm.
plays out so differently. So I work with college students who struggle with their schoolwork, right? If they're asked in a religion class, for example, at BYU, if they're asked to rate their own homework on whether they were reading the scriptures diligently, that's tormenting. They're like, well, I read it, but maybe did I skim a verse or two? And did I this and that? And maybe I shouldn't give myself full credit. Like, that is torment for a teacher to ask someone with scrupulosity to grade their own work. Or a parent who is careful with changing diapers with their children, or having any contact with their children physically because they're afraid that they may do something inappropriate. Or a cousin, an adult cousin, goofing around with the boys, the 13-year-old boys, being afraid. So it really becomes a problem because they question their intentions and they torment themselves. Were my intentions completely pure? So let me give you an official definition of scrupulosity for the listeners who might not understand it very well. I realize we didn't do that. It's a psychological disorder primarily characterized by pathological guilt or obsession associated with moral or religious issues that is often accompanied by compulsive moral or religious observance and is highly distressing and maladaptive. So if you're a highly religious person, you're not more susceptible to scrupulosity. But if you are someone who grows into OCD in your life, or gets hit very quickly with OCD in your life, if you're a religious person, your OCD may become manifest in that way. And it happens because OCD attacks the things you value the most. You think about it, if you care about your relationship with God, if you care about your integrity, if you care about the law of chastity, and you have unwanted obsessions that are contrary to your value, that feels threatening. So then you start wanting to control that to make it go away. And then you get wrapped up in this vicious cycle as you outlined.
That's just a great point. And I think a huge piece in recognizing the everydayness of this, of how it can seep in. I remember sitting in a young single adult institute class, and there was a professor from UVU that was a religion professor, and he was talking about thoughts that come in. And he said, I've had to learn over the years that when a thought comes in and I think, what, where did that come from? Then I just say, no, I don't want to think that. And then I move on. He said, whereas before it would have stressed him out, like, what's wrong with me, right? And so I love this idea of being objective about what's coming into our minds or what's happening in our lives, and not taking it so personally and putting on this label and judgment on ourselves.
Right. Well, and that's where people get tripped up with scrupulosity. If you have obsessive compulsive disorder, fear of contamination, the germ issue that's commonly portrayed in the media, the popular Hollywood movies or whatever, people have insight. They recognize that their fears about the germs are irrational. But in the religious world, people misinterpret it for interpretations, promptings of the spirit. Well, maybe this is the spirit telling me this or that. But in OCD, it's an unwanted, intrusive obsession. Obsessions are irrational, so it does no good to try to analyze them. You won't get anywhere with it. It doesn't mean anything. And people want to attribute meaning. Well, I must have some deep moral failing that I've had this thought. I can promise you, I've had lots of blasphemous and inappropriate thoughts just in the last week, and they're out of my brain before they're even fully in. This is what brains do. We have 50 to 70,000 thoughts a day, according to some Google I did once.
Exactly.
50 to 70,000 a day. And so we learn to just kind of roll with the punches. But when OCD gets involved, the brain structures start to not work in automatic pilot very well, and they can't roll with the punches. The thoughts start to cycle and they can't let them go. And that's what I help people to do in therapy, is to learn how to get those brain structures to work in a fairly normal way again. And
that's perfect, because that sounds like once it hits a switch point, you come to this sort of fork in the road of, this could go down the rabbit hole, or if I use a coping skill and I use an intentional choice, I can, circumvent this. I can do something different and not go down that path, which is not a necessary path. It's a magnified, judging, labeling, negative path. I don't have to go down that. So I can do something else.
Oh, nipping it in the bud is always, it's an easier recovery if you haven't gone down the hole at all. You can do positive coping statements, such as, that thought won't be helpful to me right now, or I have OCD, this is an unwanted obsession, trying to figure out where it came from won't be useful to me. Some self-talk can be very powerful. Also, a little bit of distraction can be useful. Go do something you like, go do something fun. Just give yourself a mental break. And I'm always a huge advocate of doing things to help you physiologically soothe, such as deep breathing, to really calm your central nervous system, because when the anxiety symptoms start to flow, it is hard to shut down the thoughts, because the body and the mind are so interconnected. So you're right. If you can avoid going down the rabbit hole, don't let yourself go there, because it's much harder to dig yourself back out.
Absolutely. And then the insight that it takes to see that you're going down the rabbit hole and then get yourself back out. That's a hard thing to do on your own.
It's a tremendous amount of work. Tremendous amount of work.
And this can be even in small bits. Like I was even just reading with my little guy last night, my 8-year-old, and we were kind of just cuddling and finishing reading and talking, and he was getting a little bit stressed about some things that were happening this weekend. And he started breathing. We've worked on this 4x4 breathing, and he started breathing on his own, doing that. And I was so pleased to see that he could see it wasn't like he was having a full-blown stress meltdown, but he was starting to feel anxious about some things, and he could naturally go to breathing. So I love that you give these simple tools, the self-talk, which is so crucial to be able to talk yourself out of it. And that's a healthy thing. And then the distraction to do something you like, and then the deep breathing.
Now, let me give you one more, if that would be okay.
Oh, love it.
Particularly with those struggling with more of the rigidity and the lack of flexibility, is to challenge the distortion in the thinking. So for example, with toxic perfectionism, you see a lot of double standards, right? People hold themselves to a much higher standard than they were ever put on their child or their friend or their spouse. So for example, you can challenge a double standard. You can ask someone, is it fair to have harsher rules for yourself than for everyone else? Or what is the impact of holding a different set of standards for yourself than for others? Or another one that we see a lot is the shoulds, right? Oh, I should have done this, or I should have done that. How does saying should to yourself constantly make you feel? In what way does it impact your sense of self? Or what impact do you think it might have if you applied the sort of pressure you apply on yourself to a close friend? Well, I imagine if you did that to a close friend, you would damage and maybe lose the friendship, right?
Absolutely.
We treat ourselves so harshly.
Absolutely. And I love that you make that point, that to challenge that line of thinking. I think about Dallin H. Oaks, where he gave a talk once that said, where will this lead? And I think about that. I talk about that with my kids when they start thinking of different thoughts or making even choices or whatever. Then we talk about, where will this lead? Like, where can you see this getting you 5 steps down the road? And I love the point that you bring out of, if you have these high standards, if you have this way of judging yourself, where's that going to lead? You're going to end up looking at other people that way, and unwittingly you're going to judge them by that same thing, that same lens, because that's what we see through. So I love that you encourage that, challenging the thinking, and especially with some of those phrases. Have you seen people change this, being able to move forward from it with coping skills?
Oh, absolutely. Now, when people really get entrenched in the OCD scrupulosity, you need more than just the kind of coping skills we're talking about. These will be great for someone struggling a little bit with some toxic perfectionism, but they're generally healthy and such. When you get into really where you're struggling to function in life, your life is getting shut down because OCD is imposing too many rules on what you need to do. You'll need more treatment for that. The gold standard for obsessive compulsive disorder treatment is exposure response prevention and cognitive behavioral therapy. And so that is more comprehensive than what we're talking about today. So your listeners who are struggling at a higher level can seek out treatment and get that kind of benefit. The exposures, particularly that you do, you expose yourself to the thing that triggers your anxiety, which sounds terrifying to people. That's not what they want to do. But by doing that, they learn that they actually can tolerate their own anxiety. It's not a crisis that's going to put them in the grave. But anxiety always makes you feel like, oh, that you're going to end up in the ER, kind of thing. It's just everything is urgent with anxiety. Everything's a crisis. So with the OCD treatment, people learn that they can tolerate anxiety, and it'll actually go away on its own if you just kind of leave it for a minute. So they would need more treatment than just what we've talked about today. But what we've talked about is excellent intervention for all people along that spectrum. Again, if you could prevent going down the rabbit hole, you don't have to recover as far.
And I love what you're saying with just starting with some of these simple things, and then you'll have an idea if you need help, which is, there's no shame in that. I love that.
Yes.
Our current environment is really getting rid of and eliminating more than ever this stigma. When there's so many mental health problems, I remember talking with a therapist once who said, we live in a schizophrenogenic society. It is a society that creates mental health problems. So if you're struggling with mental health, that's kind of normal because you're in a really abnormal environment. So this isn't a shame. And for people listening, especially for women, I hope that you can feel that, and that the leader that you are in the home, as leading out with your children and showing them by example, if you have issues with this or one of your children do, to be able to sit it on a chair per se and say, look, noticing these things, let's just look at it. Let's see what we can do. When you have a scrape, we do a Band-Aid. When we have these kinds of things, these are the coping skills we can try. And I can say from personal experience, I have a sweet daughter who has some OCD tendencies, and we've learned to banter about it, to make it a little bit of fun, just have some fun with it. And she's been able to use some small steps to make some changes, and it's happened over time, where she's been able to pull out the good things of the OCD, which is structure and consistency. And she's been able to temper it so that she's had some flexibility with it. So I want to attest to the fact that when you get treatment, when you have consistent practices on this, it really does shift, and she has a happier quality of life. So I really
absolutely. OCD is not a moral failing. It's a brain disease. It's a mental illness, and the brain structures are not working as they should on automatic pilot. So we have to, in therapy, learn to kind of work around those issues and create that functioning in a healthy way on purpose. But it is not a moral failing. Now in Scrupulosity, because the content of the obsessions is religious, people mistake it and often think it's a moral failing on their part. You have to resist that. And remember, obsessions are irrational. They don't mean anything. And if you take that approach and say, I'm going to get treatment for my anxiety, you can reclaim a meaningful belief system. You can find joy in your personal religious worship again, because OCD hijacks it and just destroys it so that it just tortures people. But you can reclaim that. But it's an issue about anxiety. It's not an issue about worthiness or sin or moral failing and those types of concerns.
I love intention. And that is such a huge piece in how people feel about this, and then whether or not they're going to do something about it. And again, taking out that shame piece that we are the ones that judge and put that on ourselves, that it
Exactly.
doesn't belong there. This has been so fantastic and so helpful. And for people who are listening, who are like, I think I need a little bit of extra help with this. I know we mentioned at the beginning that you have online courses that can be really beneficial for this. Where can someone find out this information? Where can they access those if they would like those?
So the best way to get access to all of the information that I got out there is my website, which is debramcclendon.com, DebraMcclendon, debramcclendon.com. My parents didn't spell it the biblical way, so I need to always make sure people know not to spell it Deborah. That's not my name. So
I
there.
love it. Thank you
But
so much.
and there are links there to the online courses, but also to other podcasts and articles. So that would be the best place to start.
This is so helpful. And I'm sure I have gotten great stuff out of this, and I'm sure listeners have too, being able to help themselves and their families and family members, because it affects all of us in some fashion to some degree. Thank you so much for being with us today. This has been a delight.
You're most welcome anytime.
Thank you so much for listening to the Purpose Filled Life podcast. If you want more of these great podcasts, go ahead and rate, review, subscribe below. And as always, I have great freebies and downloads and TV segments and all kinds of goodies to help you live a purposeful, organized, and joyful life. And you can check those out all at ConnieSokol.com. Hope to see you there so that you can take the next step in living your purpose-filled life. Thanks for watching. As always, hit that like button, click on that bell to get some future videos right into your inbox. And if you want all the other goodies like podcasts, best-selling books, results-getting programs, and all that jazz, then go to ConnieSokol.com. I got lots of goodies there for you. And if you want to connect on social media, I'm on all platforms, so join me there because I want to connect with you right now and help you step into your purpose-filled life.